Chapter 1. The Peculiar Invitation. The Morning Post arrived at Miss Jane Marple's cottage with unusual punctuality, delivered by young Tommy Hartwell, who seemed rather more excited than the delivery of letters typically warranted. Among the usual correspondence, a note from her nephew Raymond, a circular from the local Women's Institute, and what appeared to be yet another appeal from a charity she'd never heard of, lay an envelope of distinctive cream-coloured paper, sealed with an embossed crest she didn't immediately recognize. "That's a fancy one, Miss Marple," Tommy observed, lingering at her garden gate longer than strictly necessary. "Came by special delivery yesterday evening, it did. From London." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the envelope with the careful attention she gave to all unexpected developments in her quiet village life. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and entirely unfamiliar. The return address bore the name Bellwether Health Resort and Spa, Somerset. "How curious," she murmured, more to herself than to Tommy, though the boy's ears were sharp enough to catch every word. Inside, written on matching cream paper in the same flowing script, was an invitation that grew more intriguing with each line. "Dear Miss Marple, you come highly recommended by mutual friends as a lady of exceptional discretion and insight. I find myself in need of someone with your particular talents. The Bellwether Resort has developed something of a reputation for remarkable rejuvenation treatments, but I fear there may be more to our success than meets the eye. I would be most grateful if you could accept my invitation to spend a week with us as my personal guest. All expenses will be covered, naturally. There are matters here that require the attention of someone with your unique perspective on human nature. Your urgent response would be most appreciated. Cordially yours, Mrs. Venetia Thornfield, Proprietress, Bellwether Health Resort." Miss Marple read the letter twice, then set it carefully on her morning tea tray beside her cup of perfectly brewed Earl Grey. How very odd. She was quite certain she'd never heard of Mrs. Venetia Thornfield, nor could she imagine who these mutual friends might be. Her reputation, such as it was, remained largely confined to St. Mary Mead and its immediate vicinity. "Rejuvenation treatments," she repeated softly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. At her age, the very concept struck her as both amusing and slightly suspect. In her considerable experience, people who promised to turn back the clock usually had rather more sinister motives than simple vanity might suggest. Yet something in the carefully chosen words intrigued her. The phrase, "more than meets the eye," suggested the writer was aware of some deception or irregularity. And your unique perspective on human nature, well, that was either a remarkable coincidence or someone knew rather more about her past, involvement in certain unpleasant matters than they ought to. The telephone's shrill ring interrupted her contemplation. Her neighbour, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, was on the line, her voice bubbling with the sort of excitement that typically accompanied village gossip of the highest order. "Jane, my dear, you'll never guess what I've just heard from my cousin Marjorie in Bath. She's been staying at some frightfully expensive health resort in Somerset. The Bellwether, I think she said. And the most extraordinary things have been happening." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Indeed, Dolly? What sort of extraordinary things?" "Well, according to Marjorie, the guests there are all claiming to have experienced the most remarkable improvements. Not just feeling better, mind you, but actually looking years younger. She said there's a woman there who swears she's lost 20 years from her appearance in just a fortnight." Of course, Marjorie's always been rather susceptible to such claims, but she sounded quite convinced. "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes returning to the cream-coloured letter on her tray. "But here's the really peculiar part, Jane. Marjorie said there have been some rather unsettling incidents as well. Guests becoming ill quite suddenly. And then, well, this is where it becomes rather macabre. Some of them have simply disappeared, checked out in the middle of the night without a word to anyone. The staff claims they left of their own accord, but Marjorie isn't convinced." Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, her mind turning over this information like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that hadn't yet formed a recognizable picture. "Did your cousin mention the proprietress by any chance? A Mrs. Thornfield?" "Oh, yes, she did. Said she was a most elegant woman, very well preserved for her age, though nobody seems quite sure what that age might be. Beautiful clothes, impeccable manners, but something about her eyes that made Marjorie rather uncomfortable. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple glanced again at the invitation, noting how the morning light caught the cream paper and made the embossed crest shimmer slightly. "Oh, just idle curiosity, my dear. You know how these old ears of mine prick up at the mention of anything unusual." After ending her conversation with Dolly, Miss Marple sat in her garden chair for quite some time, watching the early autumn sun filter through her apple tree and listening to the comfortable sounds of village life proceeding around her. The postman's whistle, Mrs. McGillicuddy calling her cat, the distant sound of the church bells marking the hour. It was peaceful, familiar, and entirely safe. Which was precisely why, she realized with a small sigh, she was already composing her acceptance letter to Mrs. Venetia Thornfield in her mind. Her nephew Raymond had often accused her of having an unfortunate attraction to trouble, and she supposed he might be right. But, in her experience, trouble had a way of finding those who needed help, whether they sought it or not. And if Mrs. Thornfield's carefully worded invitation was any indication, help was very much needed at the Bellwether Health Resort. Besides, she thought with a touch of her old humour, at her age, the promise of rejuvenation treatments might prove quite entertaining, if nothing else. Though she rather suspected that whatever was happening in Somerset had very little to do with genuine restoration of youth, and a great deal to do with the sort of human folly and wickedness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. By the time she'd finished her second cup of tea, Miss Marple had made her decision. She would write to Mrs. Thornfield this very afternoon, accepting her mysterious invitation. If there were indeed people in danger at the Bellwether Resort, then someone needed to look into the matter properly. And if there weren't, well, she could always use the rest. Chapter 2. Arrival at Bellwether. The train journey to Somerset had been pleasant enough, though Miss Marple found herself paying rather more attention than usual to her fellow passengers. The invitation to Bellwether had arrived only 3 days ago, yet here she was, carpet-bag in hand, stepping onto the platform at Little Wickham Station with the curious sensation that she was walking into a carefully orchestrated performance. The motor car that awaited her was impressive. A gleaming black Bentley driven by a uniformed chauffeur who introduced himself as Parks, with the sort of respectful deference typically reserved for visiting royalty. As they wound through the countryside, Miss Marple noted the increasing affluence of the surroundings, manicured hedgerows, imposing gateposts, and glimpses of grand houses set well back from the road. "Been working at Bellwether long, Parks?" she inquired pleasantly, her pale blue eyes taking in the man's rigid posture and carefully neutral expression. 5 years come Christmas, madam. Mrs. Thornfield is a most particular employer." There was something in his tone that suggested volumes left unsaid. But before Miss Marple could pursue the matter further, the car turned through an impressive set of wrought-iron gates, topped with the same crest she'd seen on her invitation. The drive curved gracefully through parkland that might have graced a National Trust property, leading to a Georgian mansion of considerable elegance and size. Bellwether Health Resort looked nothing like Miss Marple's idea of a typical spa. No gaudy signs or commercial trappings marred its classical facade. Instead, it possessed the understated grandeur of a private country estate, which she suspected was entirely intentional. Mrs. Venetia Thornfield met her personally at the entrance, and Miss Marple's first impression was of a woman who had indeed discovered some secret of preservation. Her hostess appeared to be perhaps 55, with the sort of bone structure that photographs, beautifully in silver hair, arranged in an elaborate coiffure that belonged to a more glamorous era. Her dress, a flowing creation in midnight blue silk, was both expensive and expertly cut to flatter a figure that seemed remarkably well maintained. "Miss Marple, how delightful that you could come." Mrs. Thornfield's voice carried the cultivated tones of someone who had worked hard to erase any trace of humble origins. "I do hope the journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, allowing herself to be escorted through a marble-floored entrance hall, decorated with fresh flowers and tasteful antiques. "What a beautiful home you have here." "Thank you. Bellwether has been in restoration for nearly 2 years now. We've tried to maintain the original character while incorporating modern amenities for our guests' comfort." Mrs. Thornfield gestured toward an elegant sitting room where several people were taking afternoon tea. "Perhaps you'd like to meet some of our other residents before settling into your suite." The term residents rather than guests struck Miss Marple as curious, but she followed her hostess into the room with her usual air of gentle interest. What she observed there, however, was far from usual. The first person she was introduced to was Colonel Bantwick, a distinguished gentleman with a military bearing who claimed to be 78 but looked scarcely 60. His handshake was firm, his posture erect, and his eyes held the bright alertness of a much younger man. "Remarkable place, this," he confided in a stage whisper that carried clearly across the room. "When I arrived 6 months ago, I could barely climb a flight of stairs. Look at me now." He executed a small but energetic bow that would have done credit to a dancing master. Next was Mrs. Fortescue, a widow from Cheltenham who insisted she had regained not only her youthful appearance, but also energy she hadn't possessed since her 20s. Her hands, Miss Marple noted with interest, were smooth and soft as a girl's, though her eyes held the unmistakable depth that comes only with age and experience. "The treatments here are simply miraculous," Mrs. Fortescue gushed, her voice carrying the breathless enthusiasm of a true convert. "Dr. Meadows has revolutionized everything we thought we knew about aging. Haven't you, Doctor?" Dr. Rupert Meadows, who had been quietly observing from beside the fireplace, stepped forward with the measured grace of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. He was perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair, and the sort of classically handsome features that suggested he might once have considered a career on the stage rather than in medicine. "Mrs. Fortescue is too kind," he replied, though his smile suggested he agreed entirely with her assessment. "We simply apply the latest advances in cellular regeneration, combined with proper nutrition and carefully monitored exercise. The human body is remarkably resilient when given the proper support." Miss Marple nodded politely, though something in the doctor's manner reminded her of a travelling salesman she'd once encountered who had tried to convince her that his potent medicine could cure everything from rheumatism to melancholia. The same confident charm, the same carefully rehearsed explanations. How fascinating, she murmured. And have you published your findings in any medical journals? I'm sure the scientific community would be most interested. For just a moment, Doctor. Meadows's smile faltered. The research is still in its preliminary stages, I'm afraid. We prefer to perfect our methods before subjecting them to outside scrutiny. Of course, Miss Marple agreed, though she filed away his brief discomfort for future consideration. The final member of their little group was Lady Pemberton, a woman of indeterminate age who had apparently been at Bellwether longer than any of the others. She was elegantly dressed and beautifully preserved, but something in her manner suggested an underlying fragility, as if she were a delicate piece of china that might shatter at the slightest jarring. "Miss Marple, how lovely," Lady Pemberton said, her voice soft and oddly distant. "Are you here for the full treatment, or just a consultation?" "I'm not entirely certain," Miss Marple replied truthfully. Mrs. Thornfield was rather vague about the specifics in her invitation. "Venetia is always mysterious about her methods," Lady Pemberton laughed, though the sound held little genuine amusement. "That's part of the charm, isn't it? The not knowing exactly what miracle they're working on you." As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the curious atmosphere of the place. The guests or residents all seemed genuinely convinced of their transformation, yet there was an underlying tension she couldn't quite identify. Conversations seemed to halt abruptly when she approached, and more than once she caught someone watching her with an expression of barely concealed anxiety. Most peculiar of all was the noticeable absence of staff. Apart from Parks, the chauffeur, and Mrs. Thornfield herself, she had seen only a handful of servants, all of whom moved through the public areas with the silent efficiency of well-trained ghosts. When she was finally shown to her suite, a beautifully appointed set of rooms on the second floor with views across the grounds, Miss Marple took a moment to collect her thoughts. Everything about Bellwether was designed to impress and reassure, yet she felt neither impressed nor reassured. Instead, she had the distinct sensation of being an actor who had wandered onto a stage without knowing her lines, surrounded by a cast who were all performing roles they had learned by heart. As she unpacked her few belongings, Miss Marple reflected on the day's observations. Whatever was happening at Bellwether, it was certainly more complex than simple vanity treatments for wealthy ladies. The question was whether it was merely an elaborate fraud, or something considerably more sinister. Either way, she had the feeling that her quiet week of rest and observation was going to prove anything but restful. Chapter 3. The First Treatment. Miss Marple woke to the sound of rain pattering against her bedroom windows, and the distant chiming of a church bell marking 7 o'clock. The morning light filtering through the heavy curtains was grey and subdued, lending an air of melancholy to what had seemed elegant and welcoming the evening before. She had slept poorly, disturbed by sounds in the corridor outside her room, soft footsteps, whispered conversations, and what had sounded remarkably like someone weeping. When she had gone to investigate, peering cautiously through her door, the hallway had been empty and silent, lit only by the soft glow of electric sconces that cast long shadows on the Turkish carpet. A discreet knock interrupted her morning ablutions. A young woman in a crisp white uniform entered with a breakfast tray, introducing herself as Nurse Williams, with the sort of professional cheerfulness that Miss Marple had observed in hospitals and sanatoriums. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Mrs. Thornfield has arranged for your initial consultation with Doctor. Meadows at 10 o'clock, followed by your first treatment session. I do hope you slept well." "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple lied politely, settling herself at the small table by the window. The breakfast was elaborate: fresh fruit, coddled eggs, and what appeared to be homemade bread with local honey. "Tell me, Nurse Williams, how long have you been working here?" "Just over a year now." The nurse busied herself arranging towels in the adjoining bathroom, but Miss Marple caught a brief tightening around her eyes. "It's very rewarding work. The guests respond so wonderfully to our treatments." "I'm sure they do. Such remarkable improvements from what I observed yesterday. Colonel Bantwick, for instance, he seems positively rejuvenated." "Oh yes, the Colonel is one of our greatest successes." Nurse Williams's smile became fixed, as if painted on. "Though, of course, results vary from person to person. Dr. Meadows will explain everything during your consultation." After the nurse departed, Miss Marple ate her breakfast thoughtfully while observing the grounds through her window. Despite the early hour, she could see several figures moving through the gardens, guests taking their morning constitutional, she assumed, though something about their movements seemed oddly purposeful rather than leisurely. At precisely 10 o'clock, she made her way to Dr. Meadows's consulting room, a handsomely appointed space that managed to suggest both medical authority and drawing-room comfort. The doctor himself was impeccably dressed in a white coat that looked as though it had been tailored rather than purchased from a medical supply company. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you again. I trust you found your accommodations satisfactory." He gestured for her to take a seat in a leather chair positioned strategically across from his mahogany desk. "Very comfortable indeed, thank you." Miss Marple settled herself with her usual air of gentle interest. "I must admit, Doctor, I'm rather curious about these treatments of yours. At my age, one becomes rather skeptical of promises to turn back the clock." Dr. Meadows laughed, though the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. "Perfectly understandable, my dear lady, but you mustn't think of our work here as some sort of fountain of youth nonsense. We simply apply the most advanced principles of cellular regeneration and metabolic enhancement." He launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed explanation involving hormonal balance, antioxidant therapy, and something he called bioelectric stimulation. Miss Marple listened with the polite attention of someone who understood perhaps half of what was being said, though in reality her sharp mind was cataloguing every evasion, and noting the practiced way he deflected her more specific questions. "Of course, we must begin with a comprehensive examination," Dr. Meadows concluded, rising from his chair. "Nothing invasive, you understand. Just some basic measurements and blood work to establish your baseline." The examination was indeed thorough, though Miss Marple noticed several peculiarities. The equipment appeared remarkably sophisticated for what was ostensibly a health spa, and Dr. Meadows took particular interest in examining her hands and the skin around her eyes with a magnifying device she didn't recognize. "Excellent bone structure," he murmured, making notes on a chart. "And your muscle tone is quite remarkable for a woman of your years. You've maintained yourself admirably." "Good genes, I suppose," Miss Marple replied modestly, though she was beginning to feel rather like a prize heifer, being evaluated at market. Her first treatment session took place in what Dr. Meadows called the rejuvenation chamber, a dimly lit room dominated by what appeared to be a medical examination table surrounded by various humming machines. Nurse Williams was present, along with a second nurse Miss Marple hadn't met previously, a stern-faced woman of middle years who introduced herself simply as Sister. "Now then, Miss Marple, if you'll just lie back and relax," Dr. Meadows instructed, adjusting what looked like a series of electric lamps positioned around the table. "You may feel a slight tingling sensation, but nothing unpleasant. The bioelectric field works to stimulate cellular regeneration at the molecular level." As the treatment commenced, Miss Marple found herself bathed in a warm, pulsing light that did indeed produce a tingling sensation throughout her body. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but neither was it particularly soothing. More disconcerting was the way both nurses watched her with an intensity that seemed to go beyond normal medical observation. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Meadows inquired after perhaps 20 minutes. "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, though in truth she was beginning to feel slightly nauseated and oddly light-headed. "Excellent. That's perfectly normal for a first session. The cellular awakening process can be somewhat overwhelming initially." As the treatment concluded and she was helped from the table, Miss Marple noticed something that made her decidedly uneasy. On a tray near one of the machines lay several vials of what appeared to be blood samples, each labelled with a name. She caught sight of Fortescue and Pemberton before Sister quickly moved to block her view. "Just routine monitoring, Doctor," Meadows explained smoothly, having noticed her glance. "We like to track our patients' progress through regular blood analysis." Walking back to her room afterward, Miss Marple felt genuinely unwell for the first time in months. Her legs were unsteady, and there was a strange metallic taste in her mouth that reminded her unpleasantly of the time she'd accidentally bitten her tongue rather badly while gardening. She was resting in her sitting room, trying to shake off the peculiar after-effects of her treatment, when she heard raised voices from the room next to hers. Through the thin walls, she could make out what sounded like an argument between Mrs. Fortescue and someone she didn't recognize. A man's voice, cultured but agitated. "I won't stand for it any longer," the man was saying. "This has gone far beyond what we agreed. People are asking questions." "Questions from whom?" Mrs. Fortescue's voice was sharp with anxiety. "Does it matter? The point is, we need to stop before someone gets seriously hurt. Or worse. It's too late for that now. Far too late. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not." The conversation dropped to whispers then, leaving Miss Marple straining to hear more. But what she had overheard was quite enough to confirm her growing suspicions. Whatever was happening at Bellwether, it was not simply an elaborate hoax designed to separate wealthy ladies from their money. As she sat in her comfortable chair, watching the rain continue to fall across the manicured grounds, Miss Marple reflected on the events of the morning. The sophisticated equipment, the blood samples, the obvious fear in both patients and staff, it all pointed to something far more sinister than fraudulent beauty treatments. The question was no longer whether something wrong was happening at Bellwether, but rather how wrong, and how many people were already too deeply involved to escape whatever web had been woven around them. She had the distinct feeling that her first treatment session had been as much about studying her as treating her. And if that were the case, she needed to be very careful indeed about what she revealed in the days to come. Chapter 4. An Unexpected Departure. The following morning brought unsettling news delivered with the sort of artificial cheerfulness that Miss Marple had learned to distrust instinctively. Mrs. Thornfield appeared at breakfast, wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and an announcement that fell upon the assembled guests like a stone dropped into still water. "I'm afraid we must bid farewell to dear Mrs. Pemberton this morning," she declared, her hands clasped before her in an attitude of regretful necessity. She received rather urgent news from her family and felt compelled to leave us immediately. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, noting the quick exchange of glances between Colonel Bantwick and Mrs. Fortescue. Lady Pemberton, who had seemed so fragile the day before, had struck her as someone with very little family left to summon her anywhere urgently. "How unfortunate," she murmured. "I do hope nothing too serious has occurred." "One never knows with family matters," Mrs. Thornfield replied smoothly. "She left very early this morning. Didn't want to disturb anyone with lengthy goodbyes, you understand. Such a considerate woman." Dr. Meadows, who had been quietly consuming his breakfast at a corner table, looked up with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Mrs. Pemberton left, but she was scheduled for her final treatment series this week. Rather unusual for her to abandon the program so close to completion. Something flickered across Mrs. Thornfield's face. Annoyance, perhaps, or warning. "As I said, family emergencies take precedence over everything else. I'm sure you understand, Doctor." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Miss Marple noticed that the atmosphere remained distinctly strained. Mrs. Fortescue barely touched her breakfast, and Colonel Bantwick kept glancing toward the empty chair where Lady Pemberton had sat the previous evening, his usual hearty demeanour notably subdued. After breakfast, Miss Marple took what appeared to be an aimless stroll through the gardens, though her route was carefully calculated to take her past the servants' entrance and the motor court. Her timing proved fortuitous, as she encountered Parks polishing the Bentley with rather more vigour than the vehicle seemed to require. "Good morning, Parks," she said pleasantly. "Such a shame about Lady Pemberton having to leave so suddenly." The chauffeur's hand stilled on the car's bonnet. "Left, did she? Funny thing, I wasn't asked to drive anyone to the station this morning. Course, there's other ways to get about, I suppose." "Oh yes, of course. Perhaps a family member collected her." Parks resumed his polishing with increased intensity. "Can't say as I saw any visitors, miss, but then I don't see everything that goes on here, do I?" The emphasis he placed on the last sentence suggested he saw quite enough to make him uncomfortable, though he clearly wasn't prepared to elaborate further. Miss Marple thanked him for his time and continued her constitutional, filing away this interesting piece of information. Her wanderings took her past what appeared to be a service building set some distance from the main house. Through an open window, she caught sight of something that made her pause and pretend to examine a particularly fine specimen of late roses growing nearby. Inside the building, she could see Dr. Meadows in heated conversation with a man she didn't recognize, tall, thin, and wearing the sort of expensive suit that suggested London origins. Their voices were raised enough for her to catch fragments of their discussion. Can't simply keep disposing of them when they become inconvenient. Knew the risks when they agreed to participate. Police will eventually start asking questions. Leave that to me to worry about. The unknown man moved toward the window, and Miss Marple quickly busied herself with the roses, humming softly as if she hadn't a care in the world. When she glanced up again, both men had disappeared from view, though she could still hear the murmur of their voices from deeper within the building. Returning to the main house, she found Mrs. Fortescue in the morning room, staring out at the gardens with an expression of profound melancholy. The transformation she had boasted about the previous day seemed somehow less convincing in the grey morning light. Or perhaps it was simply that fear had a way of aging people, regardless of whatever treatments they might have received. "Such a lovely garden," Miss Marple observed, settling herself in a nearby chair with her knitting. "Though I must say I miss Lady Pemberton's presence already. She seemed such a gentle soul, Mrs. Fortescue started slightly, as if she had forgotten she wasn't alone. Yes, she was very fragile. Perhaps it's for the best that she's gone. Oh? In what way? Well, I mean, Mrs. Fortescue caught herself, her hands fluttering nervously. I simply meant that if her family needed her, then naturally she should go to them. Family obligations and all that. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while continuing her knitting, a skill that had proven remarkably useful over the years for encouraging confidences. There was something about the gentle click of needles that seemed to relax people's natural reserve. I do hope she'll be all right, she continued conversationally. She seemed rather anxious yesterday evening. I couldn't help but notice. Anxious? Mrs. Fortescue's voice rose slightly. What makes you say that? Oh, just a feeling one gets. When you reach my age, you develop a certain sensitivity to people's moods. She struck me as someone carrying a considerable burden. Mrs. Fortescue was quiet for a long moment, her fingers worrying at the fabric of her dress. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. We all carry burdens here, Miss Marple, some heavier than others. Before Miss Marple could respond, Colonel Bantwick appeared in the doorway, his usual military bearing somewhat diminished. Ah, there you are, Mrs. Fortescue. Mrs. Thornfield is asking for you in her office. The woman rose immediately, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. Of course. Excuse me, Miss Marple. After she left, Colonel Bantwick remained standing in the doorway, his weathered face troubled. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with an expression of mild inquiry. Unsettling business, Lady Pemberton, leaving so suddenly, he said finally. Indeed, though perhaps not entirely unexpected. The Colonel shot her a sharp look. What makes you say that? Oh, just an impression. She seemed to be struggling with something yesterday. Sometimes people reach a point where they simply must make a choice, mustn't they? Yes, he said slowly. Yes, I suppose they must. He turned to leave, then paused. Miss Marple, might I offer you a word of advice? This is a peculiar place, with peculiar people. It might be wise to be careful about forming attachments. People here have a tendency to disappear rather suddenly. With that cryptic warning, he departed, leaving Miss Marple alone with her knitting and her increasingly dark suspicions. As she sat in the quiet morning room, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a disturbing picture. Lady Pemberton hadn't left voluntarily. She was quite certain of that now. The question was whether she had been removed because she had become inconvenient, as the unknown man had suggested, or whether something worse had befallen her. Either way, Miss Marple realized she was now walking a very dangerous line. She needed to uncover the truth about what was happening at Bellwether, but she also needed to avoid becoming the next inconvenient guest to require sudden disposal. The thought that she might already be too late to help Lady Pemberton filled her with a familiar mixture of sorrow and determination that had driven her through other dark discoveries in her long life. Chapter 5. Nocturnal Investigations. Miss Marple had always been a light sleeper, a trait that had served her well during various unpleasant episodes in her past. So when the soft sound of footsteps in the corridor woke her at 2:30 in the morning, she was instantly alert and listening intently. The footsteps were careful, deliberate, trying not to make noise, but not quite succeeding on the old floorboards. They paused outside her door for a moment, long enough for her to hold her breath, before continuing down the hallway toward the main staircase. After waiting several minutes to ensure whoever it was had moved well away, Miss Marple slipped on her dressing gown and opened her door a careful inch. The corridor was dimly lit by wall sconces turned low for the night, casting long shadows that made identification difficult. But she could just make out a figure descending the main staircase. Someone in dark clothing, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Her curiosity thoroughly aroused, Miss Marple made a decision that her nephew Raymond would undoubtedly have described as foolhardy. Slipping her feet into soft slippers, she crept from her room and followed at a discreet distance. The figure ahead of her moved through the main hall and toward the back of the house, past the morning room and into what appeared to be a service corridor. Miss Marple hadn't explored during her daylight wanderings. She followed carefully, grateful for the thick carpeting that muffled her footsteps, keeping well back in case her quarry should turn around. The corridor led to a heavy oak door that stood slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, every instinct warning her that descending into the cellars of Bellwether in the middle of the night was precisely the sort of thing that led to unpleasant consequences in Gothic novels. However, Lady Pemberton's unexplained disappearance and the increasingly ominous atmosphere of the place convinced her that conventional caution was a luxury she could no longer afford. Taking a deep breath, she began her descent. The stairs were stone, older than the house above, and led to what had clearly once been wine cellars. But the space had been extensively modified. Electric lights had been installed, and several rooms had been fitted with modern doors bearing small windows of reinforced glass. The entire area hummed with the sound of machinery, and there was an odd medicinal smell in the air that reminded Miss Marple unpleasantly of the hospital where she had once spent several uncomfortable weeks recovering from a particularly nasty fall. Ahead of her, the figure she had been following disappeared through one of the modern doors. Miss Marple crept closer, noting that the rooms seemed to be some sort of laboratory or medical facility. Through the glass windows, she could see equipment that was far more sophisticated than anything Dr. Meadows had shown her during her treatment session. In the first room, she observed what appeared to be several examination tables equipped with restraints, surrounded by machines whose purpose she could only guess at. The second room contained rows of glass containers filled with various substances, some of which seemed to glow with an unnatural phosphorescent light. It was the third room that made her blood run cold. Through the small window, she could see what was unmistakably an operating theatre, complete with surgical lights and an array of instruments laid out on sterile trays. But more disturbing still were the photographs mounted on the walls, before and after pictures showing dramatic transformations that went far beyond what any legitimate medical treatment could achieve. As she watched, Dr. Meadows emerged from a fourth room, followed by the unknown man she had glimpsed arguing with him earlier. Both men were wearing surgical scrubs, and there was something about their manner that suggested they had just completed some significant procedure. "The process is accelerating, Doctor," Meadows was saying as they moved toward what appeared to be an office at the far end of the corridor. "We may need to consider moving the entire operation." "Absolutely not," the other man replied sharply. "Too much has been invested here to abandon it now. We simply need to be more selective about our subjects." "And what about the Marple woman? She's asking too many questions." Miss Marple pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding, as the two men passed within feet of her hiding place. "Leave her to me," the unknown man said. "I have experience dealing with troublesome old ladies." Their voices faded as they entered the office, but Miss Marple had heard quite enough. Whatever was happening in these underground rooms, it was far removed from the rejuvenation treatments advertised upstairs, and she was quite clearly in considerable danger. Moving as quietly as possible, she began to retrace her steps toward the staircase. But as she passed the fourth room, the one from which the two men had emerged, she noticed that the door had been left slightly ajar. Against her better judgment, she paused to peer inside. What she saw there would haunt her for the rest of her days. The room contained several beds, but they were occupied not by sleeping patients, but by figures that appeared to be in some sort of suspended animation. Their faces were peaceful, almost youthful, but there was something profoundly wrong about their stillness. Tubes and wires connected them to various machines, and their breathing, while regular, seemed somehow mechanical. In the bed nearest the door lay a woman whose face Miss Marple recognized with a shock of horror. It was Lady Pemberton, looking younger than she had in life, but undeniably dead, her skin having taken on the waxy pallor that no amount of treatment could disguise. Miss Marple stumbled backward, one hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Whatever diabolical experiments were being conducted in these cellars, Lady Pemberton had been one of the victims, and if the conversation she had just overheard was any indication, Miss Marple herself was being considered for similar treatment. The sound of footsteps approaching the office door galvanized her into action. Moving more quickly than she had in years, Miss Marple hurried toward the staircase, her mind racing with the horrific implications of what she had discovered. Bellwether was not a health resort, but a charnel house, where wealthy guests were lured with promises of rejuvenation, only to become subjects in some nightmarish medical experiment. The successful patients she had met were either willing accomplices or victims so deeply under the influence of whatever treatments they had received that they no longer questioned their circumstances. As she climbed the stairs back toward her room, Miss Marple's mind was already working on the problem of how to escape Bellwether and alert the authorities. But she knew it would not be simple. She was isolated in the countryside, surrounded by people who were either complicit in the horror or too deeply compromised to help. Worse still, Dr. Meadows and his mysterious accomplice now suspected her of being a threat to their operation. She had perhaps hours before they decided to take action against her. Reaching her room safely, Miss Marple locked the door and pushed a chair against it for good measure. Then she sat in the darkness by her window, watching the grounds for any sign of unusual activity, while her mind worked frantically on a plan. She had uncovered a horror beyond anything she had previously encountered, but she was not yet ready to become its next victim. Lady Pemberton's death would not go unavenged, and whatever monstrous scheme was being perpetrated at Bellwether would be brought to light. The question was whether she could survive long enough to ensure justice was done. Chapter 6. A Dangerous Game. Dawn came slowly to Bellwether, filtering through Miss Marple's windows like a reluctant witness to the horrors she had discovered in the night. She had not slept again after her terrifying expedition to the cellars, instead spending the dark hours planning her next moves with the methodical precision that had served her well in previous encounters with human wickedness. By 7 o'clock, she had reached several important conclusions. First, that attempting to flee Bellwether immediately would likely prove fatal. The isolation of the estate and the obvious resources of those running the operation made escape during daylight hours virtually impossible. Second, that her only hope lay in convincing Dr. Meadows and his accomplice that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a harmless elderly lady seeking rejuvenation treatments. Most crucially, she needed to gather concrete evidence of what was happening in the underground facility before making any attempt to contact the authorities. Without proof, her story would sound like the ravings of a disturbed old woman. When Nurse Williams arrived with her breakfast tray, Miss Marple was ready to begin the most dangerous performance of her life. "Good morning, my dear," she said brightly, settling herself at the breakfast table with every appearance of cheerful anticipation. "I must say, I'm feeling quite remarkably improved after yesterday's treatment. When might I expect my next session?" The nurse's professional smile seemed more genuine this morning, suggesting that Miss Marple's enthusiasm was being reported to the right quarters. "Dr. Meadows would like to see you at 11 o'clock. He's very pleased with your initial response to the therapy." "How wonderful! I must admit, I was rather skeptical when I first arrived, but the results speak for themselves, don't they?" Miss Marple held up her hands, examining them with apparent satisfaction. "I could swear these old fingers look younger already." After Nurse Williams departed, Miss Marple continued her charade by appearing in the morning room for breakfast, where she regaled Mrs. Fortescue and Colonel Bantwick with enthusiastic observations about her improving complexion and increased energy levels. "It's quite remarkable," she gushed, buttering her toast with hands that trembled only slightly. "I feel as though I've shed 10 years overnight. Dr. Meadows is clearly a genius." Mrs. Fortescue's response was carefully neutral, but Miss Marple caught the quick glance she exchanged with the Colonel. Both of them, she realized, were walking the same tightrope she was, trying to appear compliant while harboring deep reservations about their circumstances. "Yes," Mrs. Fortescue said slowly, "the treatments here are certainly effective." Colonel Bantwick cleared his throat meaningfully. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might care to join me for a walk in the gardens after breakfast. The morning air is particularly invigorating." Miss Marple accepted gratefully, sensing that the Colonel had something important to communicate away from the listening ears that seemed to be everywhere at Bellwether. Once they were safely among the rose beds, well away from the house, Colonel Bantwick's military bearing reasserted itself. "I'm going to speak plainly, Miss Marple, because I believe you're an intelligent woman who deserves to know what she's gotten herself into." His voice was low but urgent. "Bellwether is not what it appears to be. The treatments, the rejuvenation claims, it's all a front for something much more sinister." "Oh my," Miss Marple replied, injecting just the right note of confusion into her voice. "Whatever do you mean?" "I mean that people don't leave here the same as they arrived, and some, like poor Lady Pemberton, don't leave at all." He paused, studying her face carefully. "The question is, how much do you already know?" Miss Marple made a swift decision. The Colonel was clearly an ally, and she needed one desperately. "I know that Lady Pemberton didn't leave voluntarily," she said quietly, "and I suspect the treatments involve considerably more than bioelectric therapy." Relief flooded the Colonel's weathered features. "Thank God! I was beginning to think I was the only sane person left in this madhouse." He glanced back toward the house, then leaned closer. "Mrs. Fortescue and I have been trying to find a way to expose what's happening here, but we're being watched constantly. They've made it clear that any attempt to leave or contact the outside world would have unpleasant consequences." "How long have you known?" "About 6 weeks. That's when I started noticing the discrepancies. Guests who supposedly left but whose belongings remained. Strange sounds from the cellars at night. The way certain patients became increasingly docile after their advanced treatments." His jaw tightened. "I'm a military man, Miss Marple. I recognize a prison camp when I see one, regardless of how luxurious the accommodations." And Mrs. Fortescue arrived 2 months ago for what she thought would be a simple health cure. By the time she realized the truth, she was already too deeply involved to escape safely. They've convinced her that her family believes she died in a car accident. Whether that's true or not, she's afraid to risk finding out. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing horror. The scope of the operation was even larger than she had imagined. "Colonel, I must ask, have you seen the underground facilities?" His face went pale. "You've been down there?" "Last night. It's far worse than even you suspect." She described what she had witnessed in the cellar laboratories, watching his expression grow increasingly grim. "Dear God," he whispered when she finished, "we have to get word out somehow." "Agreed. But first, we need evidence that will convince the authorities. And we need to ensure that Mrs. Fortescue and any other innocent guests can be safely evacuated." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Dr. Meadows, who appeared among the rose beds with the sort of casual timing that suggested he had been watching them. "Miss Marple, Colonel Bantwick. How pleasant to see you both enjoying the morning air." His smile was as professional as ever, but Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes moved between them, assessing, calculating. "Miss Marple, I hope you're feeling well rested. We have an exciting day of treatment ahead of us." "Oh yes, Doctor. I'm feeling quite wonderful," Miss Marple replied, summoning her most convincing elderly lady enthusiasm. "I was just telling the Colonel how marvelously improved I feel already. Excellent. The bioelectric therapy seems to be particularly effective in your case." He paused, his gaze lingering on her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I'm looking forward to beginning the next phase of your treatment regimen this afternoon." As he walked away, Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The next phase undoubtedly meant that Dr. Meadows had decided she was ready for whatever procedure had befallen Lady Pemberton and the other figures she had seen in the underground chambers. "We're running out of time," Colonel Bantwick said quietly. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already racing ahead to the challenges of the afternoon. She would need to submit to whatever doctor. Meadows had planned while somehow gathering the evidence needed to expose Bellwether's true purpose. It would require every ounce of cunning and courage she possessed, but she was determined that Lady Pemberton's death would not be in vain. The monsters running Bellwether would face justice, no matter what the cost to herself. Chapter 7. The Next Phase. Miss Marple spent the hours before her afternoon appointment in careful preparation, though not of the sort Dr. Meadows might have expected. Hidden in her knitting bag, wrapped in a spare ball of wool, was a small hand mirror she had liberated from her dressing table. Sewn into the lining of her cardigan was a pencil stub and several sheets of thin writing paper, folded small enough to escape casual notice. If she was to gather evidence of the horrors taking place at Bellwether, she would need to document what she witnessed with more than just her memory. The authorities would require concrete proof, and she intended to provide it. At precisely 2:00, Nurse Williams arrived to escort her to what was described as the advanced treatment facility. Miss Marple noted with interest that they were taking a different route than before, down a service corridor she hadn't previously explored, through a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. "How exciting!" she commented brightly as they descended a narrow staircase. "I do hope this advanced treatment will be as effective as yesterday's session." "Oh, it will be much more comprehensive," Nurse Williams replied. though there was something strained about her professional cheerfulness. Dr. Meadows has developed some truly revolutionary techniques. The staircase led directly to the underground facility Miss Marple had discovered the night before, though they approached it from a different direction. In daylight, or rather, under the harsh electric lighting of the medical facility, the place looked even more sinister than it had in the shadows. Dr. Meadows was waiting in what appeared to be a consultation room, dressed in surgical scrubs and accompanied by his mysterious accomplice, who was introduced simply as Mr. Blackwood, our research coordinator. "Miss Marple, how delightful," Dr. Meadows said, though his smile never reached his eyes. "I trust you're feeling prepared for the next stage of your rejuvenation journey." "Oh yes, quite ready," Miss Marple replied, settling herself in the indicated chair with every appearance of eager anticipation. "I must say, the improvements I've already experienced are quite remarkable." Mr. Blackwood studied her with the cold assessment of a man evaluating livestock. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 45, with the sort of pale, intellectual features that suggested he spent most of his time indoors pursuing activities that normal people would find deeply unsavory. "The preliminary bioelectric therapy was indeed successful," he said, consulting a thick file that presumably contained her medical records. "Your cellular response has been quite encouraging. However, the next phase requires a more invasive approach." "Invasive?" Miss Marple allowed a note of concern to creep into her voice. "Nothing dangerous, I hope?" "Not at all, Doctor," Meadows assured her smoothly. "Simply a minor surgical procedure to implant some bioelectric enhancement devices. Tiny things, really, no larger than rice grains. They'll monitor your body's response to the treatment and provide continuous therapeutic stimulation." Miss Marple's blood ran cold, but she managed to maintain her expression of interested concern. "Surgical procedure? My goodness, I wasn't expecting anything quite so medical." "The beauty of our technique," Mr. Blackwood interjected, "is that the patient experiences no discomfort during the procedure. We use a specialized anesthetic that not only eliminates pain but actually enhances the regenerative effects of the treatment." As if on cue, Nurse Williams appeared with a metal tray containing several syringes filled with a pale blue liquid that seemed to glow with an inner light. Miss Marple recognized it immediately as one of the substances she had seen in the underground laboratory. "Now then," Dr. Meadows said, approaching with one of the syringes, "this will just take a moment. You'll feel wonderfully relaxed, and when you wake up, the procedure will be complete." Miss Marple knew she had perhaps seconds before whatever was in that syringe rendered her helpless. Her mind raced through her limited options, settling on the only one that offered any hope of survival. "Oh my," she said, pressing her hand to her chest with a flutter of apparent anxiety. "I'm feeling rather faint suddenly. Perhaps it's the excitement of the treatment, but my heart seems to be racing terribly." She allowed herself to sway slightly in her chair, one hand fumbling for her smelling salts, while the other, hidden from view, palmed the small mirror from her knitting bag. "Just a touch of nerves," Dr. Meadows said dismissively, though he paused with the syringe. "Perfectly normal before a procedure." "Oh dear, it's getting worse," Miss Marple gasped, deliberately hyperventilating. "I think I might be having one of my episodes. My doctor warned me about this. My heart condition, you know. Perhaps we should postpone the treatment until I'm feeling stronger." Mr. Blackwood stepped forward, his expression sharp with suspicion. "What sort of heart condition?" "Atrial fibrillation," Miss Marple replied promptly, naming a condition she had heard discussed at length during her Women's Institute meetings. "The doctor said any stress or excitement could trigger a dangerous episode. Oh dear, I really am feeling quite unwell." She slumped forward convincingly, using the movement to angle the mirror so she could observe the room behind her. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Additional surgical equipment being wheeled in, restraints being prepared, and most horrifying of all, a glass container filled with what appeared to be small electronic devices waiting to be implanted. "Perhaps we should call her personal physician," she suggested weakly. "He'll need to clear me for any surgical procedures, surely." The look that passed between Dr. Meadows and Mr. Blackwood spoke volumes. Whatever they had planned for her, it clearly didn't involve consulting outside medical opinions or following normal surgical protocols. "I think," Mr. Blackwood said slowly, "that we should proceed as planned. These episodes often resolve themselves once the patient is properly sedated." Dr. Meadows moved closer with the syringe, and Miss Marple realized her performance had bought her only moments of additional time. She needed a more dramatic intervention if she was to avoid sharing Lady Pemberton's fate. "Wait," she said, struggling to sit upright. "There's something I need to tell you, something about why I'm really here." Both men froze, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of uncertainty cross their faces. Mr. Blackwood gestured for Dr. Meadows to lower the syringe. "What do you mean?" Mr. Blackwood demanded. Miss Marple took a shaky breath, knowing that her next words would determine whether she lived or died. "I wasn't entirely truthful about how I learned of Bellwether. The person who recommended your services, well, they had very specific reasons for sending me here." "Explain yourself, Doctor," Meadows said sharply. "My nephew, you see, works for certain government departments. He's been investigating reports of unusual activities at private medical facilities. When he heard about Bellwether's remarkable success rates, he asked me to come here as his, shall we say, unofficial observer." It was a desperate gambit, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the guilty mind was quick to see conspiracies and government interference where none existed. The effect of her words was immediate and gratifying. Both men stepped back, their faces pale with alarm. "You're saying you're here as some sort of spy?" Mr. Blackwood's voice was dangerously quiet. "Nothing so dramatic," Miss Marple replied, injecting a note of weary resignation into her voice. "Just an old lady who agreed to visit a health spa and report back on her experiences. Though I must say, based on what I've observed, my nephew's concerns appear to have been well-founded." The two men exchanged a look that confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that whatever was happening at Bellwether was serious enough to attract unwanted government attention. Her fictional nephew's investigation had struck closer to the truth than she had dared hope. Chapter 8. Dangerous Revelations. The silence that followed Miss Marple's revelation stretched taut as a violin string. She could see the wheels turning behind Mr. Blackwood's cold eyes as he calculated the implications of her claim. Dr. Meadows had gone quite pale, the syringe trembling slightly in his hand. "Set that down," Mr. Blackwood commanded quietly, and Dr. Meadows immediately complied, placing the injection on the metal tray with obvious reluctance. "Now then, Miss Marple," Mr. Blackwood continued, his voice carrying the sort of deadly calm that made her skin prickle, "let's discuss this nephew of yours. What exactly does he do for the government?" Miss Marple allowed her breathing to steady slightly, as if recovering from her supposed heart episode, while her mind raced to construct a believable story. "Intelligence services," she said carefully. "He's rather vague about the specifics, you understand. Need to know and all that. But when certain patterns began emerging, wealthy individuals checking into private medical facilities and subsequently disappearing from their normal social circles, well, questions were raised. "What sort of patterns?" Dr. Meadows interjected, earning a sharp look from his superior. "Missing persons reports that were later withdrawn," Miss Marple improvised, drawing on her extensive reading of crime novels. "Estates being settled for people who were supposedly still alive. Bank accounts being accessed by individuals whose families believed them to be deceased. The sort of irregularities that attract attention from people whose job it is to notice such things." Mr. Blackwood moved to the window. Though being underground, it was merely a mirror designed to create the illusion of natural light, and stood with his back to them for several long moments. When he turned around, his expression had hardened into something genuinely frightening. "I think, Miss Marple, that you're lying. I think you're exactly what you appear to be. A meddlesome old woman who has seen more than she should and now hopes to save herself with creative fiction." "Oh my," Miss Marple replied, though her heart was hammering. "I can certainly understand your skepticism. Perhaps you'd like me to contact my nephew. Though I should warn you, he's expecting my report within the next 48 hours. His concern for my welfare has always been rather protective." It was a desperate bluff, but the effect was immediate. Mr. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, and she could see him weighing the risks of calling her bluff against the potential consequences if she were telling the truth. "Dr. Meadows," he said finally, "I think Miss Marple should be our guest for a bit longer, while we verify certain aspects of her story. The luxury suite in the East Wing should suffice." Miss Marple recognized the euphemism immediately. The luxury suite would undoubtedly be a secure room where she could be held while they decided whether to kill her outright or attempt to use her as leverage against her fictional government contact. "How thoughtful," she replied, gathering her knitting bag with hands that only trembled slightly. "Though I do hope this won't delay my treatment significantly. My nephew will be so disappointed if I don't return with positive results." As Nurse Williams escorted her from the treatment room, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of intense activity beginning in the facility. Additional staff members were appearing from rooms she hadn't known existed, and there was an air of controlled panic that suggested her story had hit closer to the mark than even she had realized. The East Wing luxury suite proved to be a handsomely appointed prison cell, complete with barred windows disguised as decorative ironwork and a door that locked from the outside. But it also contained something unexpected. Mrs. Fortescue, sitting by the window, with the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had abandoned all hope. "Miss Marple!" she exclaimed, rising quickly. "Whatever are you doing here?" "I'm afraid I've become somewhat inconvenient," Miss Marple replied, settling herself in the room's second chair with apparent calm. "And you, my dear? I thought you were still undergoing treatments." Mrs. Fortescue's laugh held no humour whatsoever. "I made the mistake of asking too many questions about poor Lady Pemberton. Mr. Blackwood decided I needed some time to reconsider my attitude toward the program." "How long have you been here?" 3 days, though I suspect my stay may be extended indefinitely." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "Miss Marple, you need to understand whatever you think you know about this place. It's worse than you imagine. They're not just experimenting on people, they're replacing them." "Replacing them?" "The rejuvenation treatments, the cellular regeneration, it's all real. But the price is your identity, your memories, everything that makes you who you are. They can make you look 20 years younger, but the person who emerges from the process isn't really you anymore. It's something else wearing your face." Miss Marple absorbed this horrifying information with the stoic calm. that had served her through previous encounters with human evil, and the guests who leave successfully? Carefully selected accomplices who help maintain the illusion. They receive genuine but limited treatments in exchange for their cooperation. Colonel Bantwick is one of them, though I don't think he fully understood what he was agreeing to when he first arrived. And Lady Pemberton? Mrs. Fortescue's face crumpled. She discovered the truth about what they were doing. She tried to escape, to warn someone. They couldn't risk letting her leave, but they also couldn't risk the questions her disappearance would raise. So they... She couldn't finish the sentence. They used her as an experimental subject, Miss Marple completed quietly. Yes, and when the process went wrong, as it sometimes does, they simply disposed of the evidence. As far as the outside world knows, Lady Pemberton is living quietly in a private nursing facility, occasionally writing letters to old friends. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than Miss Marple had suspected. Not only were they conducting horrific experiments on unwitting victims, but they had created an entire network of deception to cover their tracks. Mrs. Fortescue, how many people do you think are involved in this operation? More than you'd believe. It's not just medical experimentation, it's a complete industry. Wealthy people pay enormous sums for genuine rejuvenation, while others are recruited as unwilling test subjects. The successful procedures fund the research, while the failures are simply erased. A sound in the corridor outside interrupted their conversation. Footsteps, multiple sets, approaching with purpose. Miss Marple quickly positioned herself by the window, affecting an air of elderly confusion, while her mind raced through possible escape scenarios. The door opened to admit Mr. Blackwood, accompanied by two men Miss Marple didn't recognize, both large, well-dressed, and carrying themselves with the sort of professional competence that suggested military or police backgrounds. Miss Marple, Mr. Blackwood said pleasantly, though his eyes remained cold. I've had the most interesting conversation with some colleagues of mine. It seems your nephew's investigation is even more comprehensive than you suggested. Miss Marple's heart sank. Either her bluff had been called, and they had discovered she was lying, or, far worse, there actually was some sort of government investigation underway, and she had inadvertently stepped into the middle of it. Indeed, she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. Yes, and I'm afraid it means that your stay with us will need to be extended considerably. There are some people who are very eager to discuss your nephew's activities with you, in great detail. The way he emphasized the last three words made it clear that the discussion would not be pleasant for anyone involved. Miss Marple realized that her desperate gambit had not saved her life. It had merely postponed her death, while potentially making it considerably more unpleasant. But as she looked at Mrs. Fortescue's terrified face, and thought of Lady Pemberton's lifeless form in the underground laboratory, she felt a familiar surge of determination. She might not be able to save herself, but she could still ensure that the truth about Bellwether came to light. Chapter 9. The Turning Tide. The interrogation room they brought her to an hour later was designed to intimidate. Stark white walls, harsh lighting, and a metal table that looked as though it had seen considerable use for purposes that had nothing to do with afternoon tea. Miss Marple settled herself in the uncomfortable chair with the resigned air of someone who had accepted her fate, though her mind remained sharp as a razor. Mr. Blackwood sat across from her, flanked by his two associates who had introduced themselves with obvious pseudonyms. To her left sat a woman she hadn't seen before, elegantly dressed, perhaps 50, with the sort of predatory intelligence that reminded Miss Marple unpleasantly of certain headmistresses she had encountered in her youth. "Miss Marple," the woman began, her voice cultured but cold. "I am Mrs. Ashford, and I oversee security for our organization. I understand you've been making some rather creative claims about government connections." "Not creative at all, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I suspect you've already discovered that for yourselves." Mrs. Ashford smiled, though the expression never reached her eyes. "Indeed we have. Your nephew Raymond West, crime novelist, has no connections whatsoever to any intelligence services. Your story was, as Mr. Blackwood suspected, complete fiction." Miss Marple felt a sinking sensation in her stomach, though she managed to maintain her composure. "I see. How disappointing for all of us." "However," Mrs. Ashford continued, "your little deception has had some unexpected consequences. You see, when we began investigating your background to verify your claims, we discovered something rather interesting. Several police forces have files on you, Miss Marple. It seems you have quite a reputation for involving yourself in criminal investigations." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Miss Marple realized that her past had finally caught up with her in the most dangerous possible way. Her involvement in previous murder cases, which she had always tried to keep quiet, had now marked her as a genuine threat to the Bellwether operation. St. Mary Mead, Little Wickham, even Scotland Yard, they all have records of your assistance in solving various unpleasant crimes, Mrs. Ashford said, consulting a thick file. "Detective Inspector Slack describes you as an interfering old busybody with an unfortunate talent for uncovering inconvenient truths. I think that assessment is remarkably accurate." "How flattering," Miss Marple murmured. "Which brings us to our current dilemma," Mr. Blackwood interjected. "You are quite clearly not the harmless elderly tourist you pretended to be. You are, in fact, exactly the sort of person who could cause us considerable difficulty if allowed to leave here with knowledge of our operations." "On the other hand," Mrs. Ashford added, "your reputation for discretion is also well documented. Several cases were resolved without any public scandal, much to the relief of the families involved. This suggests you understand the value of keeping certain matters private." Miss Marple sensed they were building towards some sort of proposition, though she couldn't imagine what form it might take. "I'm listening," she said simply. "We're prepared to offer you a choice," Mrs. Ashford continued. "Option 1, you undergo our complete treatment protocol. Your memory of recent events will be adjusted, and you'll return to St. Mary Mead with vague recollections of a pleasant health cure. You'll live out your remaining years in comfort, though with certain monitoring to ensure your continued discretion. And option 2." Mr. Blackwood leaned forward. "You join our organization. Your investigative skills could be quite valuable to us. There are occasionally complications that require someone with your particular talents to resolve. Wealthy clients who become difficult, potential whistleblowers who need to be managed, that sort of thing." Miss Marple considered this with the detached interest of someone examining a particularly unpleasant insect. "You're offering me a position as a problem solver for a criminal organization that murders innocent people for medical experiments." "I prefer to think of it as consultation, work," Mrs. Ashford said smoothly, "and the compensation would be quite generous. Enough to ensure a very comfortable retirement. And if I refuse both options?" The look that passed between her interrogators provided all the answer she needed. Lady Pemberton's fate awaited anyone who proved both uncooperative and inconvenient. "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "Might I have some time to consider?" "Of course," Mrs. Ashford replied, "though I should mention that time is somewhat limited. We have other guests arriving tomorrow, and their treatments cannot be delayed indefinitely." As they escorted her back to the locked room, Miss Marple's mind was working furiously. The revelation that they had investigated her background suggested access to police files and government databases. This was no small-scale operation run by a rogue doctor and his accomplice. The scope of the conspiracy was enormous, with tentacles reaching into law enforcement and possibly even higher levels of government. Mrs. Fortescue was waiting anxiously when she returned, and Miss Marple quickly filled her in on the conversation, keeping her voice low in case the room was monitored. "They offered you a job?" Mrs. Fortescue whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It would appear my reputation precedes me," Miss Marple replied dryly, "though I suspect their offer is more in the nature of slavery than employment." "What will you do?" Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, staring out through the barred windows at the manicured grounds where she had first met Colonel Bantwick. "I'm going to accept their proposition," she said finally. "Miss Marple, you can't possibly—" "My dear Mrs. Fortescue, I have no intention of becoming their accomplice, but accepting their offer will give me access to information and resources that could help expose this entire operation. Sometimes the best way to destroy something is from within. It's too dangerous. If they suspect you're deceiving them, they already suspect it," Miss Marple pointed out. "The question is whether they believe my value as an asset outweighs the risk of keeping me alive. And frankly, it's our only chance of ensuring that Lady Pemberton's death serves some purpose." That evening, when Mrs. Ashford returned for her answer, Miss Marple was ready. "I accept your offer of employment," she said calmly, "though I do have some conditions regarding my working arrangements." Mrs. Ashford smiled with genuine amusement. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Miss Marple. On the contrary, I think you'll find my conditions quite reasonable. After all, if you want my cooperation, you'll need to trust me to some degree. And trust, as any good detective knows, must be earned by both parties." As she outlined her modest demands, access to certain areas of the facility, regular contact with Mrs. Fortescue, and a full briefing on the scope of the organization's activities, Miss Marple was already planning her next moves. They thought they had captured a meddlesome old woman and turned her into an asset. What they had actually done was place their most dangerous enemy in the perfect position to bring their entire operation crashing down around them. The hunters, Miss Marple reflected with grim satisfaction, were about to become the hunted. Chapter 10. The Final Gambit. Miss Marple's new role as security consultant granted her access to areas of Bellwether that had previously been forbidden, though she was always accompanied by one of Mrs. Ashford's associates, a precaution that spoke volumes about the level of trust her new employers actually placed in her. Over the next 3 days, she methodically gathered information while maintaining the facade of a reluctant but pragmatic collaborator. What she discovered exceeded even her darkest suspicions about the scope of the operation. The underground facility was far larger than she had initially realized, extending beneath the entire estate through a network of tunnels that connected to similar installations at other properties. Mrs. Ashford had been quite forthcoming about the organization's reach. 17 facilities across England and Scotland, with expansion planned for the continent. "We prefer to think of ourselves as pioneers in human enhancement," Mrs. Ashford explained during one of their orientation sessions. "The technology we've developed here represents the future of medicine. Unfortunately, traditional regulatory bodies lack the vision to appreciate its potential. How fortunate that you found a way to proceed without their interference, Miss Marple observed mildly, making notes in the small book Mrs. Ashford had provided for her reports. Indeed, though it does require a certain flexibility in our patient selection process. Miss Marple had learned that the patients fell into several categories. Wealthy clients who paid enormous sums for genuine rejuvenation treatments, carefully selected individuals who were recruited as test subjects under various pretenses, and a third group that Mrs. Ashford referred to euphemistically as special cases, people who had been targeted specifically because their disappearance would serve the organization's purposes. Lady Pemberton had belonged to this final category. Her substantial inheritance, now being administered by lawyers who believed she was living quietly in Switzerland, was funding expansion of the operation. 3 other guests currently at Bellwether were in similar situations, their assets being gradually transferred to accounts controlled by the organization. The medical procedures themselves were a horrifying blend of legitimate regenerative therapy and experimental enhancement techniques that had been developed using technologies stolen from legitimate research institutions. Dr. Meadows, she learned, was merely one of several physicians involved in the program, though his theatrical personality made him useful for maintaining the health spa facade. On her 4th day as a consultant, Miss Marple was given her first assignment, investigating a potential problem at one of the sister facilities in Yorkshire, where a former patient had begun asking uncomfortable questions about missing friends. "Mrs. Ashford," she said when presented with the file, "I'm concerned that my reputation might work against us in this case. If the local police recognize me, it could raise questions we'd prefer to avoid." "An excellent point," Mrs. Ashford agreed. "Perhaps this assignment would be better suited to one of our other consultants." It was exactly the response Miss Marple had hoped for. Instead of being sent away from Bellwether, she was assigned to investigate security concerns at the facility itself. Mrs. Fortescue, she was told, had been asking too many questions about the organization's financial arrangements, and there were concerns about her reliability. "I'll need complete access to her background and activities here," Miss Marple said, affecting a professional tone. "And I should probably interview Colonel Bantwick as well. He's been her primary social contact during their stay." That evening, under the guise of conducting her investigation, Miss Marple was able to meet privately with both Mrs. Fortescue and Colonel Bantwick in the locked East Wing. What she told them sent both into shocked silence. "The scope is unimaginable," she explained quietly, certain that their room was monitored, but confident that her role as investigator provided cover for the conversation. 17 facilities, hundreds of victims, and financial resources that suggest government or institutional backing. "What can we possibly do against something that large?" Mrs. Fortescue whispered. "Exactly what I've been doing for the past 4 days," Miss Marple replied, producing the small notebook Mrs. Ashford had given her, documenting everything: names, dates, financial arrangements, locations of other facilities. Mrs. Ashford has been remarkably forthcoming, believing she's recruiting me into their organization. Colonel Bantwick leaned forward. "But how do we get this information to the authorities? We're prisoners here, regardless of what they call us." Miss Marple smiled, the first genuinely pleased expression she had worn since arriving at Bellwether. "Colonel, what was your military specialty before retirement?" "Communications and intelligence," he replied, looking puzzled. "Excellent. Then you'll appreciate the significance of this." She opened her notebook to a page covered with what appeared to be her usual elderly lady's scrawl, but which the Colonel immediately recognized as something quite different. "Good God," he breathed. That's a military communication code. Modified, but yes. I learned it from a young man during the last war who was quite convinced that elderly ladies made the perfect intelligence operatives because no one ever suspected them of being capable of such work. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with memory. Every page of notes I've taken contains a coded message detailing what I've learned about the organization's structure, activities, and personnel. But who are you sending the messages to? My nephew Raymond may not work for the government, Miss Marple said, but he does have friends in journalism who specialize in investigative reporting, and certain connections in Scotland Yard who trust my judgment despite Inspector Slack's unflattering assessment. She explained that she had been using her access to Mrs. Ashford's office to send letters, ostensibly routine correspondence, but actually containing detailed intelligence about Bellwether's operations. The letters were addressed to various friends and acquaintances in St. Mary Mead, but each contained coded instructions to forward the information to specific contacts. By my calculations, Miss Marple continued, the authorities should have enough information to begin coordinating a response within the next 48 hours. The question is whether we can survive that long. Survive? Mrs. Fortescue looked alarmed. I'm afraid my usefulness to the organization is about to come to an end, Miss Marple explained. Mrs. Ashford has been growing suspicious of my questions, and she scheduled me for a loyalty verification procedure tomorrow afternoon. Colonel Bantwick's face went pale. The same procedure they used on the guests who became too difficult? I believe so, yes. Which means we have perhaps 18 hours to ensure that Bellwether's secrets are exposed and its victims are rescued. As if summoned by her words, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside their room. Miss Marple quickly returned her notebook to her pocket and assumed the professional demeanour of someone conducting a security interview. The door opened to admit one of Mrs. Ashford's associates, who announced that Miss Marple was needed immediately for an urgent consultation. It seems, Miss Marple murmured as she rose to follow him, that our 18 hours may have been optimistic. As she walked through the corridors of Bellwether toward what she suspected would be her final confrontation with Mrs. Ashford, Miss Marple reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had come to Somerset expecting to investigate a minor fraud, and instead had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of society. Whether she survived the next few hours or not, she was confident that the truth about Bellwether would ultimately prevail. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, had a way of crushing even the most elaborate criminal enterprises. The only question was whether she would live to see it happen. Chapter 11. Justice Arrives. The urgent consultation proved to be a trap, though not quite the sort Miss Marple had expected. Mrs. Ashford was waiting in her office, but she was not alone. 3 men in dark suits stood behind her desk, clearly not part of this. The Bellwether staff, and equally clearly not there for rejuvenation treatments. Miss Marple, Mrs. Ashford said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury, I believe you know Detective Inspector Craddock of Scotland Yard. Miss Marple's heart leapt with recognition and relief as she saw the familiar face of one of her few allies in official law enforcement. Inspector Craddock, a competent man who had learned to respect her insights over the years, stepped forward with an expression of grim satisfaction. Miss Marple, we received your messages. Rather ingenious, that coded correspondence system of yours. He turned to Mrs. Ashford with obvious distaste. Mrs. Ashford, or should I say Mrs. Margaret Thornton, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and a rather impressive list of other charges." The transformation in Mrs. Ashford's demeanour was immediate and complete. The cultured facade dropped away, revealing something far more primitive and dangerous underneath. "You interfering old witch!" she snarled at Miss Marple. "Do you have any idea what you've destroyed? Years of research, millions of pounds in investment, medical breakthroughs that could have changed the world. By murdering innocent people," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I'm afraid I find it difficult to appreciate the scientific value of work built on such foundations." Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook. "We've been conducting simultaneous raids on all 17 facilities based on the intelligence Miss Marple provided. So far, we've arrested 43 individuals and discovered evidence of at least 78 victims over the past 3 years." 78, Miss Marple repeated quietly, the number hitting her like a physical blow. She had suspected the scope was large, but hearing it confirmed was still shocking. "Including Lady Pemberton, whose body we found exactly where you indicated. The preliminary autopsy suggests she died during one of their experimental procedures." Craddock's voice was professionally neutral, but Miss Marple could see the anger burning in his eyes. Mrs. Ashford laughed bitterly. Procedures that would have revolutionized medicine if small-minded people hadn't interfered. The subjects who died contributed to research that could have saved millions of lives. They didn't volunteer to contribute, Miss Marple pointed out. They were murdered for their money and used as laboratory animals. There's a considerable moral distinction. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the office windows, Miss Marple could see police cars and ambulances filling the circular drive, along with what appeared to be a mobile medical unit. "The other victims?" she asked Craddock. "We found 12 people in the underground facility in various stages of their treatment program. Most appear to have been drugged into compliance, but they're alive. Mrs. Fortescue and Colonel Bantwick are already being checked by the medical team." Relief flooded through Miss Marple. At least some of Bellwether's victims would survive to return to their lives. "What about Dr. Meadows and Mr. Blackwood?" "Meadows is in custody. Blackwood... Craddock's expression darkened. "He managed to escape during the initial breach, but we'll find him. He won't get far with every port and airfield in the country being watched." Mrs. Ashford straightened in her chair, attempting to regain some dignity despite the handcuffs that now secured her wrists. "You think this is over? You've captured one facility, arrested a handful of operatives. The research will continue. There are people with far more resources and influence than you can imagine who believe in this work." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said calmly, "but they'll find it considerably more difficult to continue now that their methods have been exposed. The families of the victims will be asking questions, the medical community will be conducting investigations, and the press will be watching for any similar operations. Sometimes the best way to stop a conspiracy is simply to drag it into the light." As the police led Mrs. Ashford away, Inspector Craddock turned to Miss Marple with an expression of grudging admiration mixed with exasperation. "Miss Marple, I have to ask, what possessed you to accept an invitation to a mysterious health resort and then involve yourself in an undercover investigation without contacting the authorities?" Miss Marple considered the question seriously. "I suppose I thought it would be a quiet week in the countryside. How was I to know that rejuvenation treatments would prove to be quite so literally deadly? And when you discovered the truth?" "Well, Inspector, someone had to stop them. Lady Pemberton and the others deserve justice, and there were still people in danger. Sometimes one simply has to do what needs doing, regardless of the personal risk. Craddock shook his head. You could have been killed. If your coded messages hadn't reached us in time, if we hadn't been able to coordinate the raids. But you did, Miss Marple pointed out practically. And the important thing is that Bellwether's victims will receive justice, and no one else will suffer the same fate. Later that evening, after giving her statement and being cleared by the medical team, Miss Marple found herself sitting in the morning room where she had first met the other guests. The elegant space looked exactly the same, but the atmosphere was entirely different. No longer a stage set for deception, but simply a room in a house where terrible things had happened. Mrs. Fortescue joined her, looking pale but determined. The drugs had been cleared from her system, and she was scheduled to return to her family the following day. Miss Marple, I owe you my life. If you hadn't exposed what was happening here— Nonsense, my dear. We all did our part. Colonel Bantwick's military expertise was invaluable, and your courage in questioning their activities helped alert me to the true situation. What will happen to this place? Miss Marple looked around the morning room, thinking of all the hopes and fears that had filled it over the past week. I imagine it will be sold eventually. Perhaps it will become a genuine health resort, or a school, or simply a private home again. Buildings themselves are rarely evil. It's the purposes to which they're put that matter. As she prepared for bed that night, in a room that was no longer a luxurious prison, Miss Marple reflected on the events of the past week. She had come to Bellwether seeking rest, and had instead encountered one of the most elaborate and horrifying criminal enterprises of her experience. But justice had prevailed, as it usually did when ordinary people refused to accept that evil should triumph simply because it wore an elegant disguise. Lady Pemberton and the other victims would not be forgotten, and their deaths had ultimately served to prevent many more tragedies. It wasn't the peaceful week in the countryside she had originally planned, but Miss Marple had to admit it had been considerably more interesting than her usual routine in St. Mary Mead. Though she sincerely hoped her next invitation to a health resort would prove rather more genuine than this one had.